The board approved new landscaping that was supposed to cost $9,000, but the final bill was $27,000, and no one could explain why. It started with a number that didn't make sense. 9,000 had somehow become 27. The invoice sat in the treasurer's hands, its pages crisp and heavy, yet the weight of it pressed down like stone. By the time word spread across Brookmeadow Estates, whispers had already turned into full-blown questions. What had happened to the money? Who had approved the changes? And why did no one seem able to explain the simplest thing, how a small landscaping project had tripled in cost overnight? Brookmeadow Estates was the kind of neighborhood where people took pride in maintaining order. Front lawns were clipped to perfection, cars sat gleaming in driveways, and neighbors waved politely but rarely crossed the invisible lines of privacy. The Homeowners Association held monthly meetings in the clubhouse, and while attendance was usually thin, most residents trusted the board to keep things running smoothly. The clubhouse itself wasn't anything extravagant, just a low brick building with green shutters and a porch. But it was the place where decisions were made about fences, paint colors, pool hours, and fees. The landscaping project had seemed harmless at first. The shrubs near the clubhouse had grown wild, tangling with weeds. The trees by the pool dropped more branches than they should have, and the flower beds near the main entrance looked faded and tired. During the spring meeting, George Fields, the HOA president, suggested a refresh. "It's been years since we invested in the appearance of our community," he said, his voice calm but firm as always. "We can budget $9,000 for new shrubs, seasonal flowers, tree trimming, and fresh mulch. It will brighten things up." Heads nodded. The motion passed. 9,000 felt safe, reasonable, and ordinary. When the landscaping trucks arrived a week later, nobody complained. In fact, many residents felt a flicker of pride. The crew came in early mornings, their machines rumbling, their shovels clinking against stone. Curious neighbors watched from porches and sidewalks as men in neon vests measured plots, dug trenches, and carried rolls of sod. At first, the work matched expectations. Shrubs were pulled out, dirt piles rose, and tree branches came down with loud cracks. But soon, something began to feel different. The workers laid down not just mulch, but stone pavers, smooth, gray, and expensive-looking. Instead of simple plastic borders, they installed curved stone edging, carefully fitted together like puzzle pieces. Pallets of ornamental rock appeared, followed by shipments of brick that no one remembered hearing about in the meeting. "That doesn't look cheap," muttered Nancy, a retired teacher who lived across from the clubhouse. Walking her beagle one morning, she slowed down to watch. "Didn't they say 9,000? Her friend Linda shrugged, unsure but impressed. "Maybe they found a good deal?" Each day, the project grew more elaborate. By the second week, workers were wiring lights into the soil. Slim black posts with glowing heads popped up along walkways and around the pool. The flower beds exploded with colors far beyond seasonal pansies. Roses, lilies, hydrangeas, all carefully arranged in sweeping arcs. By the entrance sign of Brookmeadow Estates, a circular stone wall now held a cascade of tulips. Children on bikes stopped to stare. Adults took pictures. People admired it, but an unspoken thought began spreading. This doesn't look like $9,000 worth of work. When the last truck drove away and the previous worker packed up his tools, Brookmeadow appeared to be a model community. The clubhouse gleamed with its new garden, paths lined with bricks that caught the sunlight, hedges trimmed into neat squares, and soft golden lighting that flickered on each evening. Residents admitted it was beautiful, even stunning. But beauty came with a price, and the price arrived in the form of an envelope. Margaret Lane, the HOA treasurer, picked it up from the mailbox one gray afternoon. She carried it home, set it on her kitchen table, and slid it open with her letter knife. She had expected something routine, a neat bill with a total close to the approved 9,000. Instead, her eyes caught the bold numbers at the bottom. $27,063. She read it twice, Then 3 times, her stomach twisting. Flipping through the pages, she saw line after line. Stone pavers, premium edging, lighting fixtures, ornamental plants, irrigation systems, labor hours, consultation fees. The total never changed. 27,000. Margaret sat frozen for nearly an hour, the papers spread before her like evidence of a crime. When she finally gathered her breath, she picked up the phone and called the landscaping company. The receptionist, cheerful but dismissive, said, "Yes, ma'am, that's the correct total." "Everything is itemized. Please see your invoice." Margaret asked to speak to the manager, but was told he was out. "It's all in writing," the woman insisted before hanging up. That evening, Margaret called George, her voice tight with panic. "George, the bill, it's 27,000. That's not what we approved." On the other end of the line, there was silence, then a cough. "That has to be a mistake," George said. "Bring it to the meeting tomorrow. We'll sort it out." But even as he said it, his tone carried doubt. The next night, the clubhouse filled with more people than usual. Word had already spread through the grapevine. Neighbors whispered in clusters before the meeting began, their eyes darting to the thick packet Margaret carried. The room smelled faintly of the new flowers outside, but inside it was tense and heavy. George stood at the front, adjusting his glasses. "Thank you all for coming. We have an important matter to discuss." Margaret laid the invoice on the table. George cleared his throat and announced, "The final landscaping bill came in at 27,000. We approved 9,000. None of us expected this. We are looking into it." Gasps filled the room. A man in the back shouted, "That's 3 times what we agreed to." Another woman demanded, "Who signed for this?" Voices rose, overlapping in frustration. Margaret tried to explain what she knew, pointing to the list of charges, but every explanation only raised more questions. "Who approved stone pavers?" asked one resident. "Why did we pay for lighting?" pressed another. A young father waved the paper angrily. "And what the heck are consultation fees?" George raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd, but his own face was pale. "I don't have those answers yet." None of us do. His words only fueled suspicion. People accused the board of negligence, of keeping secrets, of wasting money that belonged to the community. By the end of the meeting, no resolution had been reached. Neighbors left in clumps, muttering under their breath. Some suggested the landscaping company had scammed them. Others suspected someone on the board had quietly approved upgrades. A few even whispered darker theories, that the money had been siphoned off, that someone stood to profit from the chaos. As the last resident walked out into the night, the new pathway lights flickered on, casting their golden glow on freshly laid stones. The gardens looked almost unreal in their beauty, but to those who passed, it wasn't beauty they saw anymore. It was a mystery, one that touched every pocket and every home. And the question that lingered in everyone's mind was the same. Who turned 9,000 into 27? And why was no one willing to admit it? Days passed after the chaotic meeting, but the question of the $27,000 landscaping bill clung to every conversation in Brookmeadow Estates. People brought it up at the mailbox, whispered about it during evening walks, and debated it over backyard fences. The once proud upgrades, those glowing lights, those stone borders, the rows of blooming flowers, now felt like evidence of betrayal. Every time a resident passed them, they were reminded of the money that had seemingly vanished into thin air. Margaret Lane, still shaken, spent her evenings hunched over the papers at her dining table. Her husband, Richard, would glance up from his newspaper and ask, "Any progress?" Margaret could only shake her head. The numbers stared back at her, cold and unchanging. She highlighted items, circled fees, and searched for signatures. Nothing made sense. She knew she hadn't signed off on extras, and she was sure no one else on the board had mentioned them either. Yet here they were. Consultation charges, irrigation system installation, premium plants imported from out of state. George Fields, the president, tried to reassure the community with a carefully worded email. He wrote that the board was working to clarify the situation and that residents should remain patient until all facts are gathered. But the email only stoked frustration. One reply, copied to all neighbors, read, "We don't want patience, George. We want answers." Another demanded to see the original contract with the landscaping company. A third accused the board of covering something up. At the following week's meeting, the atmosphere was even more tense. Residents filled every chair, some standing at the back with crossed arms. Margaret had brought copies of both the original estimate and the final invoice. She passed them around, and the murmur of voices grew louder as neighbors compared the two. The original was short and simple: shrub replacement, tree trimming, new mulch, seasonal flowers. The total was $9,000 flat. The final invoice, by contrast, ran pages long, with descriptions of projects far beyond the original scope. "How did we go from mulch to pavers?" one resident demanded. "We didn't approve that." "Who told them to put in lights?" shouted another. A mother of three, seated in the front row, stood up and waved her papers. "Look here. Special soil treatment. That alone is nearly $2,000. Where did that come from? Who decided we needed it?" The board members looked at one another, uncomfortable and uncertain. George finally spoke. "None of us authorized these additions. At least not to my knowledge." That choice of words, "to my knowledge," hung in the air like smoke. It implied a possibility that someone, maybe even one of them, had done it without the others knowing. Residents began murmuring again, louder this time. Suspicion crept in like a slow-moving shadow. After the meeting, smaller groups gathered in hushed conversations. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another now exchanged theories. Some believed the landscaping company had taken advantage of the community's inexperience. Others thought one board member might have given verbal approval for upgrades, hoping to impress the neighborhood. But the most unsettling theory was whispered by an older resident named Harold. What if someone is getting a cut? The word kickback was never said out loud in the meetings, but it floated in people's minds all the same. The possibility that one of their own leaders had arranged for extra work in exchange for personal benefit made everyone uneasy. Determined to get clarity, Margaret reached out directly to the landscaping company's manager. After days of missed calls and excuses, she finally cornered him on the phone. His tone was defensive. "Look, ma'am, we did the work requested. All additions were approved by a board representative. We don't move forward without authorization." Margaret froze. "A board representative? Who?" "I don't have that in front of me," the manager replied quickly. "But someone signed off. We don't just invent projects." Her heart pounded as she hung up. Someone had signed something. Someone from the board. But who? She called George immediately and relayed what the manager had said. George's voice hardened. "That's impossible. None of us approved anything. At least not formally. We'll need proof." The next step was clear. Find the paperwork. Contracts, change orders, signatures. Something had to exist if the company claimed approval. Margaret and George arranged a meeting with the company to review all documents, but the earliest appointment they could get was 2 weeks away. In the meantime, the community's tension only grew. One Saturday afternoon, several residents organized their own informal gathering at the park near the playground. Folding chairs were set up, and people brought iced tea and cookies, but the mood was anything but casual. Neighbors voiced their anger openly. "If the board can't control this, what's to stop more money from disappearing?" said a man named Kyle, his arms folded tightly. Nancy, the retired teacher who had first noticed the stone pavers, shook her head. "It's not just about the money anymore. It's about trust. If someone on the board is lying, we need to know who." The group decided to form a small committee of residents to oversee the investigation, separate from the board. They wanted transparency, a way to keep track of every step. Margaret, though nervous, agreed to share all the documents she had with them. She felt both relieved and anxious. Relieved to have help, anxious because this meant even more eyes would be on her and the board. As days rolled on, the new landscaping began to feel like a curse. Children played under the glow of the new lights, but parents frowned as they watched. Joggers passed the flower beds without their usual admiration. The beauty had soured, becoming a daily reminder of the unanswered questions. Late one evening, Margaret received an envelope slipped under her door. She picked it up, puzzled, and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper photocopied. It was a work order from the landscaping company. At the bottom was a signature scribbled in blue ink. The name was hard to read, but one thing was clear. It wasn't hers. She stared at it for a long time, her pulse racing. Someone had authorized at least part of the extra work, but the signature was messy, almost like it had been rushed or deliberately disguised. The discovery sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. Someone had taken action in the shadows. And now, Margaret knew, the mystery was no longer about money alone. It was about betrayal, hidden agreements, and the unsettling truth that someone she knew, someone she saw at every meeting, had quietly changed everything. She had stared at the signature for hours, tracing the loops and jagged strokes with her finger, trying to match them to someone she knew. It was familiar in shape but distorted, as if the writer had wanted to hide their identity. She thought of the board members, George with his careful handwriting, Allison with her neat teacher's script, Peter with his sloppy scrawl, and wondered if one of them had left their mark on this page. The next morning, she carried the document in her purse, her heart thudding with every step as she walked to the clubhouse. The board had scheduled another emergency meeting, and the turnout was larger than ever. Residents filled every chair, lined the walls, and even stood outside the windows, pressing close to hear what was said inside. The tension had reached a boiling point. George opened the meeting with a grim face. "We're here because this community deserves answers. We've been told by the landscaping company that someone from the board approved additional work. Tonight we'll review what we know." Margaret rose, her hands trembling as she pulled the copy from her purse. She laid it flat on the table so everyone could see. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "This was slipped under my door," she explained. "It's a work order with a signature. I don't know whose it is, but it proves someone authorized changes." Residents surged forward to glimpse the page. Some bent close, squinting at the faint blue scrawl. "That looks like an A," one person whispered. "No, it's a G," another argued. Others shook their heads, saying it was too messy to tell. The room buzzed with theories. Allison, the board secretary, stood abruptly. Her face flushed as she raised her voice. "That's not my handwriting. If anyone thinks it's me, they're wrong." George shot her a sharp glance. "No one said it was yours, Allison." "But that's what people are thinking," she snapped. "You can see the loops. It almost looks like an A. But I didn't sign anything." The crowd erupted with speculation. Neighbors turned on each other, whispering names, pointing fingers. The calm, orderly community of Brookmeadow was unraveling under the weight of suspicion. Finally, Peter, the youngest board member, raised his hand. "We need an independent handwriting analysis," he said. "Otherwise, we'll tear each other apart with guesses." His suggestion made sense, but the cost sparked more arguments. "How much will that set us back? Are we seriously spending more money on this mess? We already lost $18,000 we can't explain." George pounded the gavel. "Enough. We'll form a committee of residents to review all documents. They'll handle the investigation. We'll cooperate fully. Until then, speculation stops." The meeting adjourned in chaos, neighbors spilling into the night air, still muttering but too weary to fight further. Margaret clutched the work order tightly as she walked home, the paper crinkling in her grip. Over the next week, the newly formed resident committee dove into the mystery. They included Nancy, the retired teacher with sharp eyes; Harold, the older man with a skeptical streak; Kyle, the hot-headed father; and 3 others who wanted transparency. They met in Nancy's living room, poring over contracts, invoices, and emails. Margaret supplied everything she had, while George reluctantly handed over the official board files. What they found was disturbing. The original contract was indeed for $9,000, signed by George himself. But attached to the file were several change orders, each adding more work and more cost. One added stone pavers, another approved landscape lighting, another included ornamental plants, and each bore a signature that looked eerily similar to the one on the photocopied page. The problem was that the signatures weren't consistent. Some looked like George's, others resembled Allison's. A few seemed like clumsy imitations of Margaret's. But none were exact. It was as if someone had tried to mimic different people at different times, enough to confuse, but not enough to convince. "This isn't just sloppy," Harold muttered, adjusting his glasses. "This is deliberate. Someone forged these," Nancy frowned. "But why would the company accept them? Don't they check authorization carefully?" "Maybe they were told not to ask too many questions," Harold suggested darkly. The committee's findings spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents were furious. They demanded another meeting, this time with the landscaping company present. Margaret and George scrambled to set it up, finally convincing the manager to attend. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed to capacity. The landscaping manager, a stout man named Mr. Doyle, sat stiffly at the front table, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile stares aimed at him. George opened. "Mr. Doyle, we've received invoices and change orders that none of us officially approved. We need you to explain how this happened." Mr. Doyle shifted in his chair. "Look, we don't create change orders ourselves. Someone gave us instructions. Someone from this board. Every time we got a new request, we sent a form for signature. We got them back, signed by who?" Margaret pressed. "I don't know," Doyle admitted. "I'm not a handwriting expert." "We trusted the signatures were valid." The crowd erupted with shouts. "You charged us triple without checking properly? You scammed us!" Doyle raised his hands. "We performed the work in good faith. The upgrades weren't cheap, but they were requested. If you're saying the signatures were forged, that's not on us." The room buzzed with disbelief. Some residents didn't buy Doyle's innocence. Others weren't sure. But one thing was clear. Someone had orchestrated the upgrades, and the company had gone along without verifying. After the meeting, the committee regrouped in Nancy's living room. The evidence pointed to one conclusion. The forgeries came from inside the community. Someone with access to board documents. Someone who knew enough to imitate the signatures. But who? Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every detail. Then she remembered something small but sharp. At one of the landscaping days, she had seen Peter chatting casually with the crew. He had laughed with them, even carried a clipboard. At the time, she thought nothing of it, but now the image burned in her memory. Could it have been him? The thought unsettled her. Peter was young, eager, and always volunteering for tasks others avoided. He had access to paperwork. He was friendly with the workers, and maybe, just maybe, he had seen a way to benefit from the chaos. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart pounding. If Peter was involved, he wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. And she realized with a chill that if someone had slipped the photocopy under her door, it meant another person out there knew the truth too. Someone watching, someone warning, or threatening. The mystery was no longer just about forged papers. It was about hidden motives, secret dealings, and the uncomfortable possibility that betrayal lived right in their midst. The whisper of betrayal spread like wildfire. After the last meeting with Mr. Doyle, Brookmeadow Estates no longer felt like a quiet neighborhood. It felt like a small town gripped by scandal. Neighbors who once exchanged polite waves now eyed each other with suspicion. Groups formed along invisible lines, some siding with the board, some accusing it of corruption, and others convinced the landscaping company was behind the fraud. Every sidewalk conversation circled back to the same burning question. Who had forged the signatures that turned $9,000 into 27? Margaret found herself at the center of it all, though she had never asked for the role. Residents knocked on her door at all hours, asking for updates, demanding proof, or offering theories. Some nights she welcomed their questions, but other nights she felt crushed under the weight of expectation. She was only the treasurer, not a detective. Yet somehow, the community had decided she was the one to uncover the truth. The resident committee worked tirelessly. Nancy's living room had become their unofficial headquarters, the coffee table buried under piles of documents. Highlighters, sticky notes, and magnifying glasses littered the space. The committee pored over everything: old board minutes, budget reports, and receipts dating back years. They were looking for any clue that might explain how the forged orders slipped through unnoticed. It was Harold who made the first breakthrough. He was flipping through past financial statements when he noticed a curious pattern. "Look at this," he said, tapping the page with his finger. 3 months ago, we paid an extra $2,500 to the same landscaping company for emergency tree removal. But if you remember, there wasn't a storm that month. No trees came down. The room fell silent. Margaret leaned closer. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive," Harold said. "This isn't the first time they've billed us extra." Kyle, ever the hothead, slammed his fist on the table. "So they've been bleeding us for months. And the board just let it happen?" Margaret bristled. "No one let it happen. If there were fraudulent invoices before, they were slipped in quietly. Just like now." But Harold shook his head. "Not quietly enough. Someone signed off. Someone always signs off." The weight of his words pressed down on Margaret. She thought again of Peter with the clipboard, laughing with the crew, casually inserting himself into the process. The image wouldn't leave her. The committee decided to act. They drafted a formal letter demanding that the landscaping company provide copies of every signed work order from the past year, with dates, signatures, and scanned originals. The company hesitated at first, citing privacy and company policy. But when the committee threatened to bring in a lawyer, Doyle relented. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Nancy's doorstep. Inside were neatly photocopied work orders, stapled into sets. The committee gathered that evening to review them. The signatures varied, but all carried the same uneasy quality. Familiar enough to mimic, but never perfect. Some looked like George's, others like Margaret's, a few vaguely like Allison's. None were exact matches. "This isn't sloppiness," Nancy murmured, flipping through the stack. "It's calculated. Whoever did this wanted to confuse us, to make it look like all of you approved different things at different times." "Which means it's someone who knows us," Margaret said quietly. "Someone who's seen how we sign." The realization settled like a stone in the room. Whoever forged the signatures wasn't an outsider. They were inside, part of the community, maybe even sitting among them during meetings. Meanwhile, pressure inside the board itself was cracking. George grew increasingly defensive, his patience worn thin by the constant accusations. Allison withdrew, barely speaking during discussions, her face pale and drawn. Peter, however, grew strangely calm, almost smug. He brushed off concerns with easy smiles, offering to help sort documents or volunteer for small tasks. To Margaret, his eagerness felt like a mask, a way of staying close to the investigation without revealing too much. Rumors about Peter began to swirl. Someone claimed they'd seen him driving away with Doyle one evening after the workers had packed up. Another said he'd been spotted meeting with a supplier downtown. None of it was proven, but the whispers spread faster than facts. Peter denied everything, of course, laughing off the accusations. "Do you really think I'd risk my reputation over flowers and stones?" he joked. But the laughter sounded forced. The breaking point came at the next board meeting. The clubhouse was overflowing again, residents spilling out into the hall. Margaret sat stiffly at the table, her copy of the forged work order tucked in her folder. George tried to begin the meeting with calm words, But the crowd was restless. A man named Carter, one of the longest residents, stood up and pointed directly at Peter. "We want to know why you were seen with Doyle after hours." "Were you the one signing these papers?" The room exploded with shouts. Peter raised his hands, his voice sharp. "That's ridiculous. I met Doyle once outside of meetings because he wanted to discuss future work ideas." "That's it? Future work?" someone shouted. "We don't even want this work." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to speak, to accuse him directly, but her voice caught. What if she was wrong? What if Peter wasn't behind it? She needed proof. Real proof. George slammed the gavel. "Enough. We won't conduct witch hunts. Until we have hard evidence, no one will be accused." But the damage was done. The residents left angrier than before, their distrust boiling over. Some threatened to petition for the board's removal. Others said they'd stop paying dues until the mystery was solved. The neighborhood, once bound by shared lawns and pool parties, was breaking apart. That night, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, the house dark except for the glow of the lamp. She pulled out the photocopied work order again, staring at the signature. She remembered Peter's clipboard, his laughter, his eagerness. The pieces fit too neatly to ignore. But then another thought struck her, one that sent a cold shiver down her spine. What if Peter wasn't the mastermind? What if he was just a pawn, someone being used by someone else? Someone smarter, quieter, who knew how to manipulate from the shadows. She didn't know it yet, but the answer was closer than she realized. And when it came, it wouldn't just expose the truth about the landscaping bill, it would shake the entire community to its core. Follow now and stay updated.